Greetings and welcome to Mount Olympus. I am Hercules Invictus, and today I welcome you to Voice of Olympus. We'll be discussing living theurgy. And today we will continue looking at the Odyssey as it was told in modern times. I personally do not object to retellings. I've learned by studying various versions of the tale that it's usually tailored to address a particular audience, and it's always tweaked or destroyed, depending on whether you like the old version of the story. But I've also found that it always attracts people who are curious enough to track down the original versions of the tale and information on it. So it acts as a net, drawing new people into the fascinating study of Greek mythology and spirituality. So I will hand over the scepter to Clio Ajana, one of our esteemed fellow theurgists, and she will introduce the topic of tonight. Greetings, Clio.
Greetings, Hercules. And yeah, tonight's topic about the Odyssey. I have a viewpoint that is slightly different, only in that I like things that are true to the original text. I also do not object to the retelling of having the Odyssey. It's had a number of retellings. It's at this point over 2,700 years old, so it should. But I do object for something that's going to be seen by probably more people around the world at this moment in time, this particular version. And there have been changes made for what I think are not necessarily great purposes. As a translator, I think that any individual who writes a screenplay or anyone who decides to, I'm going to retell this, should be faithful to the text in some way, especially if that's what you're doing. You're like, yes, I'm going to be very faithful to it, except for this part. I'm going to change this one thing, or I'm going to change this one thing. And so the question I would pose to the audience, as well as to my esteemed colleagues, is whether the changes that Christopher Nolan makes in this film version of the Odyssey, seen by millions of people in theaters, in IMAX, up close and central, are actually worth the value that's being put on them by, as director and a screenwriter. I don't necessarily think that it does people who truly read the Odyssey or who are encouraged to read the Odyssey any good to have a version that, we're going to change this part at the end for what? To appease certain values. That's not why you are retelling or looking at the Odyssey or any book for that matter. So that's the question I toss out.
Thank you. And we're going to take what Clio tossed out, plus what I stated, and we're going to move along to Apollonius, who has seen the movie, whereas Clio and I have not yet seen the movie.
That's right. Yeah, I was able to see it, I don't know, something like a week or so ago. And I have to say, that I don't see many movies either in theaters or on a small screen. And so so in terms of saying whether it was a great movie compared to other movies, I'm probably not a very good judge, just because I don't have an enormous amount of exposure to it. So that said, though, we traveled about 2 hours to go to an IMAX 70 theater, and had a nice day away, my wife and I, enjoying the film. So I would say, as sort of pure entertainment, it was fine. It was. I think it was. It was a well-designed film on its own merits and well produced and all of that stuff. Again, not claiming any great expertise in movie criticism, but it was, I thought, quite entertaining. Um, I do actually remember literally when we were walking out of the theater. I think we had actually got to the street by the time I said it. I started listing to my wife a number of the things, a number of my favorite parts of the Odyssey that were missing. And, little ones and big ones. And, I thought, well, this is a true for all of us. If we've read the Odyssey, certainly if we've read it more than once, we've read it with any great attention, we've all got favorite parts, for whatever reasons. And some of them I think are favorites for most readers, but others are probably strictly personal things that just strike us in some way. And if somebody then comes along and does an adaptation like I take Nolan's movie to be, and they decide to leave out those bits or to change them in some significant way, then you say, yeah, it's disappointing, I guess is what I would say. And yes, some of these have been brought up in the press about the movie, and there's explanations for, either from Nolan or from other people about why he did this, that, or the other thing. And that's his prerogative as a film producer. Um, so, I do. It turns out, I've read the Odyssey a few times, not too many times, and the last time I read it actually was in ancient Greek. So I was just by coincidence I was using it as my ancient Greek practice, and I ended up because I was actually rather enjoying it, and so I ended up reading about 2/3 of it in ancient Greek. And that gives you a very different perspective, at least with my level of understanding of Greek. It's work, kind of line by line, it's work. So you get a sort of a close awareness of the individual word choice, and of course the metrical structure of it, it's a close reading, and so that brings out kind of a level of detail and subtlety sometimes that maybe even reading a good translation you wouldn't get. Um, and so that's kind of my most recent um, comparison that I've got to go on. I also did translated a number of individual lines from the Iliad, verses from the Iliad and the Odyssey, when I was doing a translation of the Homer Oracle. So there's 216 lines from the Iliad and the Odyssey that are used as that oracle. And so I had to do a translation that was a line by line translation because it's individual lines. And I did them in verse, in metrical translations. I used iambic hexameter. Excuse me, yeah, iambic hexameter. And amongst English translations, I tend to like verse translations because it's closer to the original. I mean, even after it was written down, it was still largely a performance. It's a script for a performance, basically. And we know there are variants, of course, to it, aside from just completely alternative parts of the sort of the Trojan cycle. And so, I think the closest we can sort of get to it in translation is a verse translation. Doesn't have to be line for line, but a verse translation. But that's hard going for a lot of people. People are not used to reading. I think it's 12,000 lines, the Odyssey, 12,000 line long poems anymore. And we have lots of really good prose translations too. And so, we're already, we're already in some sense far away from the original when we have a prose translation into another language. So then you face all of these problems of translation, right? Like Clio is alluding to. It's like, well, how can you in some sense be true to the poetry, and still have something that's readable? I have a translation. I just looked at it a few minutes ago It was done in the 1940s. It's a translation into English dactylic hexameters. Say, well, dactylic hexameters, that's what the Iliad and the Odyssey were written in. That's truer to the original, right? Yeah, but it doesn't read very well because English just doesn't work very well with dactylic rhythms. So, others have translated it like I've done with iambic meters because that works better for English. So, the idea is that, if you want something that sort of worked for ancient Greek and want something that works similarly for English, you don't stick with the dactylic hexameters. You use some other meter entirely. Um, or, like some of the old translations, like Alexander Pope's, you use rhyme. Rhyme is very natural in English, where of course, it wasn't used in um, Homeric Greek. So, it's this typical thing, and I've heard Emily Wilson talk about her recent translation, and she talks about the pacing, that typically when you translate, into another language, and particularly from ancient Greek into English, it tends to blow up, it gets wordier and the words get longer. And so you lose the pacing of the Iliad and the Odyssey, which have a very snappy sort of rhythm to them. And it's almost more like rap, in some sense, than what we maybe think of as poetry or certainly prose. And so then, how do you do that? So I think she said that because she's doing another translation of the Odyssey, that the previous one was strictly line for line, or the same number of lines. I don't know if she preserved the line breaks or not, but the same number of lines. But she said in the new one, she's going to loosen that up a little, because it was just a little bit too constraining, so it's going to be a little bit longer, I guess. She's going to allow herself two lines, sometimes, or maybe three where there were two in the original and stuff like that. I don't know. So, but what I'm trying to do is just, you know, when you're not being literal, oh, it's got to be dactylic hexameter. And of course, uh, dactylic hexameter in English is not even the same as dactylic hexameter in ancient Greek because it's a stress accent versus a length accent. So, I mean, the principles of the poetry are completely different. So, you've got to make changes if you're going to do translation at all. And then you have to try and do changes that, in some sense, are true to the original while violating the original in other ways that are less important in your mind. And that's where the particular goals and personality and, if you like, artistic skill of the translator come in. So, that's just sort of strictly translation. Now, if you talk about adaptation, then that's a whole, further ball of wax that you get into. And
I had a question where you kept going on there.
yeah, sure. I
Because,
get rattling on.
no, 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 no. I know. And this is great. Emily Wilson did not do or use the same meter. She used iambic pentameter, which for English speakers is very naturally flowing.
Yes.
We like that. There are so many things on that. And I want to say that from the translation point of view, she presents a lot of issues in her translation. I look forward to actually reading both of her translations to compare them and what she does, because she is one of the ones who also presented the argument that the screenplay was not faithful to the vision or the retelling, as Hercules would put it, of Homer with the classical version. So, in terms of adaptation, I don't know if this is where you were going, but I wonder what you think about that, because there's whole things of how many things were left out. And she's one on the chorus of the band saying it would have been better if he just didn't write it. that's, putting
Hmm.
setting
I
fire to things that maybe you don't want to as a translator who nobody knows who you are and everyone knows who he is. But I wonder if she has a point.
I
well,
know
I have
before
a hard time saying he shouldn't have done it. Um,
I know that I had a hard time with the Cyclops not saying I am no one to the
yeah. So
very,
that there
yeah,
are important things. The whole Phaeacian episode is missing, you know. That I think is sad. But part of it is on a lot of these things, I don't, yeah, I agree. It's an adaptation. And he did what he did, and in a 100 years or 1,000 years, it may be forgotten. It probably will be forgotten, and hopefully Homer will not be forgotten. I think um, that he made his artistic decisions, and I would probably have made different decisions. I would have certainly included a lot of those things because I think they're quite important to the story. He did clearly have a different, um, if you ask what is sort of the big overarching theme or message, if there, of the Odyssey as a whole. And I don't know that he's said what his vision of it was. Um, I've seen a lot of inferences about what it was, but I don't know if he's said it. I don't recall seeing it. It is not the same as my sort of vision of the overarching theme of the Odyssey, of Homer's Odyssey. So in that sense, when his decisions leave out parts that I consider very important to that, um, or in some cases put in stuff that I don't think is particularly important. Although I mean, um, I'm not of the opinion that Homer could not possibly be improved. I do think he was inspired, but that doesn't mean he couldn't in principle be improved. Somebody couldn't tell it better. There couldn't have been perhaps, or there could in the future be a better Homer in some sense. I don't think that's impossible. But anyway, I wouldn't claim that Nolan is it. So um, the argument has been made, and I think there's some truth in it, that he tried to make it more contemporary. So he downplayed the magic, he downplayed the gods, he made Odysseus kind of a soldier with PTSD and, regrets about uh, sort of a flawed hero in the modern sense, you know. Um, and um, all of which I think is not really significant in terms of Homer's Odyssey, um, or not the primary significance. So yeah, he put his spin on it. I think we all do, but he put his spin on it that diverges from mine in many respects. And in that sense, it was not as satisfying as if he had done something that adhered more closely to my own vision. Um, but you know, I wouldn't claim that I've got the best vision of it either. So um, um, I think this is what art is about, right? We we come to it, we evaluate it, we criticize it, we think, what's good and what's bad about it, what decisions were good and bad about it, and I think that's the appropriate thing to do.
people who know me fairly well, told me that, if I see the movie, I probably have some problems with the way they handle magic and the gods. So I don't, they wouldn't tell me what I have problems with, but I don't know if I'll actually have problems.
Well, I mean, that lecture between the two classicists that I mentioned, One of them, I think it was Robert Garland, I've read a number of his books. Um, and he he said that Athena was almost became Odysseus's conscience, in more of a Christian sense. And yeah, in retrospect, I can see that. It was, she was the only god that you might say was visibly represented within the film. And she had a parallel role, and to her role in the Odyssey, she kind of appeared at all of the same times. I mean, not all of them, but a number of them. And but yeah, in terms of it wasn't she acted more like something like maybe almost an angel than a Homeric goddess. Um,
That makes me wonder though, because one of the things, like you said, there are plenty of articles willing to say what has been left out. For example, um, the killing of the 12 handmaids. You mentioned the travel to Phaeacia, the whole thing of Calypso refusing to let Odysseus go. And what does that mean? Because it has a very different meaning. Um, the entire thing about how many people are in the underworld or the parents and what's said in the original poem versus what's said in the movie, the whole relationship with Circe and what happens, which also brings up the underlying question of gender and how women are portrayed in the Odyssey. And you just happen to mention Athena. So my question would be, is it that you want things to be so simplified, a contemporary version of the hero's journey, even though you are doing a screenplay of a movie where the title means journey. So it shouldn't, I'm just like, it means journey, people. So if you have this, what are you left with if you're taking out these key portions? I am not for bloodthirsty, blah, blah, etc., but I am for accuracy. And I think if you're, what I had heard about it, which also made me pause, was the term, I believe it's Xenia, looking for hospitality. Well, if that's the big thing, then there's some things that should probably have been left in. If you really want to promote hospitality, what does it mean if you are Greek and there's hospitality? Which, by the way, that concept is in other parts and other cultures of the world. So, the reason you don't just go um and insult your host, that's really bad. We each have cultures where there are accepted rules and norms. I wonder if this was something that Nolan was considering in the screenplay, or if perhaps Nolan was considering the depth of intellectual understanding of the audience who would see the Odyssey. And that's why cutting out certain things because of the perceived audience, not because of necessarily wanting to be true and faithful to the retelling, especially if you praise the Emily Watson version. I think it takes a lot to praise one version of a translation and then go in such a way that you're leaving out key chunks. Then the
yeah,
question is,
although I agree with that. I think, the again, he was not and I don't think he ever claimed to be essentially using her translation as a screenplay. I mean, he took parts from the Aeneid, he took little bits from the Iliad. Um, he used a variety of sources, so it isn't just it doesn't correspond, even in terms of its narrative, to the Odyssey, to just the Odyssey. So he put stuff in, he put extra stuff in, again from other sources, um, some from whole cloth, but mostly from other ancient sources. And then he left stuff out too, and he linearized the narrative. So in the Odyssey, a lot of it's told at the court of the Phaeacians as sort of a flashback, if you like, or a narration. But so he linearized it more than it is in the Odyssey. So yeah, he did a lot of it, and I think a lot of it was consciously suiting it to a modern audience. So the whole bit about he doesn't use xenia, he talks about Zeus's law. Okay, so people don't understand. Uh, that's reasonable, you know.
But
He
is
doesn't talk about Nostos and Kleos. He doesn't talk about those things either because he doesn't expect people to understand ancient Greek.
but I wonder though, you started earlier by saying something, and maybe for American culture, it isn't there. But considering that it's a text that is considered a part of Western classical tradition, maybe not the earliest, but one of the earlier ones. And there are places where poetry, I'm speaking as a poet, but also in having gone through things where you read, and part of understanding literature is what the value of poetry is. And there is a large movement of poetry and slam poetry in contemporary English that happens in this country, but in other countries, the idea of learning through oral tradition, and from that things that we would consider poetry, there are traditions and there are cultures where the oral practice is what keeps the culture alive. So you may have written tradition, but you have oral tradition which predates it. I think that it is in some ways objectionable that Nolan's choice to shorten and to eliminate some things is based on perhaps a presumption that people wouldn't get it, that and people are far smarter and more intellectual than I think some would give the audiences. Or it might be you're talking about an ancient text, give people the idea, go, huh, I really like this story. This is a great soap opera, because it is, and I need to go and check this out. Um, that's what in some states for education you hope that things would do. So you are lifting up instead of dumbing down. Um,
Well, you know, that from what I hear, that is in fact the effect. They say that, you know, translations of the Odyssey have been selling very well, both before the movie came out and since the movie came out. So, I mean, I think it is people are saying, you know, well, that was a pretty good story. Now I'm going to read it, and that's good if that's what's happening. And then they'll discover, you know, the parts he left out, you know, and see that there's really a deeper meaning to it, perhaps than the meaning he embodied in his particular version of it.
mhm.
Uh, I would hope, you know, um, but I think it is having that beneficial effect, you know, and it's um, you know, in fact, probably because Emily Wilson has been kind of, you know, criticizing it, people will maybe be saying, well, gee, you know, maybe I should go read her translation and find out what her objection is, which I think would be good.
I think so. And also, she is a modern translation as opposed to something from the 60s, when, on there, translators are not usually given nearly enough credit as being the voice that conveys what the author wanted into the current time period, whatever time period it is.
Well,
And
true.
I'm
The,
sorry.
That's very true. The Greek marriage custom of arpagie is usually translated from the 60s when Victorian times into rape or abduction, when
Mm,
it was basically a tradition that was written about extensively and happened extensively in the Mediterranean Sea, as it did amongst Native American tribes who described the same custom. By arrangement, the bride was taken from the tribe and married into the new tribe. And in the Persephone story, even in some versions, Hades had to get permission from Zeus before he carried off Mr. So, yeah, a lot of people come across those stories and have a totally different idea of what they mean because of the words. And
Mm.
Thanos, which is translated to virgin, didn't necessarily mean someone who didn't have sex with anyone ever. It meant someone who was self-contained, who didn't need anyone else to complete themselves. So you could have Thanos Satina be the mother of Ares with Hercules in the Etruscan tales. Because again, yes, she was a virgin, but not in the sense that we understand the word. So yeah, there's a lot of that.
Mm-hmm. And that's a wonderful point to bring up. There was something you had just said earlier, Apollonius, about when you're looking at it, I wonder, this makes me, on the one hand, it does make me, okay, yes, go to look at the film. But I confess, unless or until maybe I feel comfortable going to an IMAX theater um, with a bunch of people, maybe nearly alone and just sort of seeing it and being embraced by it. I don't want, to have something where then, is there going to be a follow-up? Because I'm torn, as you mentioned, he brings in outside sources from other well-known poetic books. But then my question would be, why? Why we feel the need to do that as opposed to just sticking with the actual Odyssey in its complete original form or parts of that? I'm just curious as to what you thought of his choice to bring in the Aeneid or his choice to bring in the Iliad in any form, whether that helped strengthen the film. I mean, obviously it's a good romp. You like it's a good adventure story, great. But were you like ick turned off by that part?
It's a good question, and I'm not sure I can answer off the top of my head. Of course, I think back to those as Hercules has talked about the old sword and sandal movies, right? Uh, that many of us enjoyed and have introduced many people to Greek and Roman mythology and to the classics, and they weren't very accurate. They weren't very true to anything that I can think of. So, I think, we might say, well, let's say I was going to, I don't know, pick Romeo and Juliet, and I want to tell a story of Romeo and Juliet. Well, there's two things I can do. I can do a filmed production of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, you know, um, and be very, very much like a live play, but not certainly not identical. Um, or, I could say, well, I'm just going to tell a story. It's a great story. Shakespeare got it from somebody else anyway. I'm just going to take the same story and tell my own version of it. And maybe even use some of the sources that Shakespeare used. I don't know if we know any of those or not, but certainly, or draw some parallels from similar stories, and film this story. Now, if I call it Romeo and Juliet, I've immediately caused some or raised some expectations that I may be disappointing. And I think that that's kind of what Nolan does when he says, I forget whether the title of the film is Odyssey or Homer's Odyssey. Certainly, if he called it Homer's Odyssey, then that was bad advertising. Um, but I could have the tale of Romeo and Juliet, and that doesn't mean I'm going to stick word for word with Shakespeare, or even have exactly the same narrative structure, I would say. And so, and then again, like I said, it's judged on its own merits, and it can certainly be compared to Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, but um, but it's a different work of art on the same theme, just like a painting of some scene. Different painters might paint the same scene and do it in quite different ways. So, um, that's why I say if you go in, and I did go in this way because I'd read some of the reviews and stuff before I saw the film, and it's like, okay, just go in. Yes, I know the story. Yes, I have expectations, but I'm just going to basically see what he does with it. Um, so, um, it's not, I'm not going to say, well, I don't ever have to read the Odyssey again, certainly. And
I
uh,
hope not. And he calls it the Odyssey,
yeah, yeah,
allows it as an epic,
an Odyssey or
the Odyssey. So that just by definition, using the definitive pronoun, definitive article, and saying, okay, so it's not any of the others. So then you think of, well, what's the most famous Odyssey I know? So even though Homer is not technically in the title, if you say, if it was just an Odyssey, it could be anything. It
So
could
let me
be,
ask you a question.
Mhm.
If he had called it, and I'm sure some marketing department actually probably made the decision, but if he had called it Odysseus's Journey Home or Odysseus's Return or The Quest of Odysseus or something like that, would you feel differently about it about the artistic decisions he made?
Um, in a sense of no, because the very end of it has a different version than what actually happens in Homer's Odyssey. Um, I think if you're going to say Odysseus' journey home, I'm going to be thinking of Homer's version of Odysseus' journey home. Do the main points line up? What happens after Odysseus gets home? What happens with the reuniting with the wife? And there's the huge scenes for that. What happens? He doesn't go off into the sunset with his wife, leaving behind his son, which is how the movie ends, correct? Sort of thing, where the movie is not trying to think. That was one of the controversies that I'd heard of, that the movie does not have, it's not Odysseus reclaiming stuff and everything else. It becomes like, well, here's what's happening. And that would be, I think there's some things that when you touch them, you have to be very careful with what you're changing. And that would be one. If the title changed, it might be okay. I really like the journey. Okay, I can take out some things of the quest because it's a long story and it's a long movie. Um, but if you get home, what happens once you actually get home? Does it follow and track according to the original story? If you're going to change that part of it in any way, what's the benefit of doing that? Like, what does that say? And I think going back to what you said about Odysseus being portrayed as a common man with PTSD, a soldier who is the equivalent of a soldier with PTSD, which everyone can relate to, saying, okay, yeah, I know someone who's been in the military with PTSD. Great. That ending shouldn't be riding off in the sunset with the wife kind of thing. That does that really stand by what is in the thing for Homer? What does it mean? Um, and I think part of it is because it's tricky taking something that is classic, so well known, that has been retold in so many ways. And maybe, as Emily Wilson, the translator, had thought, was that he shouldn't have written a screenplay. I'm not going to be that harsh, but I will say that you're close as a writer. And if you're too close, who's the one saying, well, yeah, are you hitting all the key points, all the big key points in there, including not just the beginning, not just the middle, but the ending? Endings matter because what are you left with, you know? And would you say that, for example, Xenia was the main overarching point, like how one deals with hospitality throughout and saying it's Zeus's law. Okay, fine. that brings the gods in, but not as much as you would like it to be. Hercules might be disappointed because, okay, you mentioned the god and say Zeus is law, but Zeus is real. And so I would be expecting if it's Zeus's law, Zeus is going to show up at some point as Zeus. And Athena's going to show up as Athena, not as the conscience of, but as Athena, that the gods are present because that is a part of culture, especially if you're going to have action fantasy. And there have been other films that have mentioned and have, just do any kind of search using, for example, any Greek god's name, it's going to come up first as a part of a role-playing game, probably, and then a little further down, something that actually talks about the deity. And so there are plenty of people who understand that. So my question will be, was that there enough in the film? You know?
In the Odyssey, Athena appears as mentor to Telemachus. So she doesn't appear as Athena, she appears as someone else or influencing someone else or someone else's guise. So that was very much part of the reality of the presence of the gods in worldly affairs.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I don't know why he didn't make more use of that idea. Yeah, that was certainly disappointing from my perspective. I think it's very informative the way the gods interact with people, with our world in the Odyssey and the Iliad too, for that matter. And yeah, that was definitely downplayed. I think, I mean, the comment I've heard is that at least they think he just was trying to make it more naturalistic for modern audiences.
One of the about from what I'm hearing, again, I haven't seen the film yet. I've heard various opinions, and a lot of people don't want to spoil it for me. But when I worked with mythology, when I started my first Age of Heroes initiative, which is to deal with the digital divide, most people knew of Jason and Argonauts through the Harryhausen.
Mhm.
That was the version of the tale they knew. They had no idea of we call it any of the other versions by Theodorus or by the guy who was in charge of the Alexandrian Library, or the Orphic version, or any of the other versions that were floating around. But they saw Harryhausen, so to them that was the Argonauts. So I used that to inspire them because that was the story or the version of the story that they knew. And I taught mythology for many years. In fact, I just had to stop because of my Parkinson's, because I can't see very well and I'm a flawless. But for many years too, and the kids always relate them like Leo said, the video games they play, or the cartoons they've watched, that have the Greek mythical heroes and gods and monsters in them. So these are the stories they know. And one of the things that's through the role-playing game that I've run for years in various ages on Greek mythology is to instill a lot of intriguing information, like, for instance, that you can fool Cyclopses rather easily. And a lot of the kids go back, and a lot of the adults go back and seek the original sources so they can have ways of triumphing in the game.
Well, and I mean, I know myself and many other young people, we read these stories of the gods, myths, that are all retold, in simplified language and simplified versions of the story and so forth. And eventually we graduate to reading Homer and Hesiod and the other classic sources. But yeah, I mean, they're just all. I mean, I remember the first book I bought with my own money was a little book of Greek myths. Um, it probably wasn't more than 60 pages long total, so they were very, very abbreviated. Um, yeah, this is I think these are all the ways that people get introduced to the idea of the gods, and I think that's important. And, a lot of it is motivation because, they say, I mean, a lot of people don't even read books anymore.
Right.
And so they really have to be motivated to put in the amount of attention and time it takes to read any, you know, substantial piece of text.
Well, you got that commercial. I will not mention what it's advertising, but I see it and I just chuckle every time, because you've got Heracles, you've got Aphrodite, you have Hades, and basically, oh gosh, I'm going to butcher this poor character's name. Sisyphus and the Rock.
I think you got it.
Yeah, huh.
And he's pulling, and it's like, okay. And at first I think because of the music in the background, this must be about working out because naturally, but then it's really about something else. And it's like, yes. And you're putting, you're being supportive of each other as a team. Now, you could tell you could tell myths through those series. Those are 30-second commercials. I dislike the fact that Aphrodite just looks gorgeous in her shell and doesn't really say anything. And then it looks like Hades is like, yep, it's a team, get ready to do it all over again, which makes him sound far more benevolent than what's actually happening. But it gives you an idea. What I thought of as you were speaking was if this is a way perhaps to get an introduction to the gods from a sense of theurgy. um, is there a stronger way to make a divine connection? There is a clear disconnect that if you have this, like, if you're looking at this saying, okay, this is a great introduction, which I'm gathering, maybe it's not the best introduction, it is an introduction, but not the best one. How do you make it so that individuals who might be interested can actually want to learn more or know how to get to the point of it? Or is it just saying you kind of hit or miss? Maybe you'll get it because you'll go back and read Homer, and maybe in that you'll get inspired, and maybe you'll go take a trip to Greece, and maybe in taking the trip to Greece, you'll find out something, or you'll run into someone who has something else to say. Um,
Or you'll find Joseph Campbell, or you'll find the Neo-Jungians, or who have
True.
the gods in every man, the goddesses in every woman, and all those books. Uh, One of the realizations I have, and I've devoted most of my life to just the Olympians in one way or another, is that even if I didn't exist, there's enough happening to keep people aware of the Olympians. The Olympians are everywhere. They went nowhere. They're on our government buildings and centers of art and museums, and so the gods are here. Their presence is very much part of culture. Their stories are part of popular culture, which is where they've always been. And all the plates and cups from antiquity that we have, we're fractions of. Now we have Funko characters and what do you call action figures and video games, and so that is the modern reflection of the ancient tradition. You heard the storytellers telling the myths, and there the merchants had the plates and the cups and with all the action scenes in the stories that you were hearing. So I think the gods are fine regardless of what's happening with the world. And
okay. I won't do the gloom and doom thing. I guess part of me is, especially now, when you see a lot of things on there, I'm always thinking it would be great if more people were not just aware of the gods. And yeah, you're right, they're present all over. Um, but that there is more of a, okay, having the gods present and acceptance of not just magic, but the presence of the gods in modern day images, such as in our films, where sure. And does that say that, okay, there's a fear among filmmakers or others to actually say, yep, put the gods in as actual parts of, not just as a little bit, but here, actual characters. which would say something about accepting the gods because it goes against a Christian view to believe in, the polytheistic aspect of the gods. Not saying that everyone who watched the film has to believe in them, but it leaves the door open for those who want to.
And that becomes a topic of we can devote a whole series of shows to. Unfortunately, the time for today's conversation is wrapping up, but that is a valid series of questions, and Apollonius, if you'll have to tackle them in future shows.
I'm willing I mean, I'm willing to think about it with the rest of you.
Yes, I'm willing to think about it and talk about it in future shows. I did a column in the Wild Hunt. My most recent one was on failure, and one of them dealt with it's where I faced, among other things, the anger, and this was dealing with illness and things like that, and not being able to be at Paganicon. But I realized one of the things that we have so few safe places for some, those who openly worship the gods, to actually go and be where that part is nurtured. And so I think the role of the gods being present, especially in with the rise of Christian nationalism or dominionism or whatever you want to call it, more articles, more things on there, things where you gotta have to keep quiet if your point is not a standardized everything is Christian viewpoint, which I don't believe necessarily. If you're going to say it's a good nation, you just had a film came out about hospitality, how hospitality is important. That's not a Christian concept. That's a worldwide concept. Or if you want to put it, that's a Greek concept and it goes through, but that's not to say it's a Christian concept. And what we have right now is lots of stuff that is smushed into it has to meet this thing. And so, yeah, I would be happy to look at that, Hercules, from you know, your challenge. I accept your challenge.
We'll get it in the future. I wanted to add a little bit to that. I openly have done things in the name of Olympus, and again, we have a new administration now that wasn't as keen as the past administration, but I used to lead the Interfaith Parade, and I was Grand Marshal for many years, and I used to bless the town in the name of Mount Olympus in the beginning and the end of the events that we had in the park where people from different religions talked about how their religions are celebrated in winter during the holidays. And the old mayor used to joke around whenever I was at some event that they received the blessing of Olympus because I was in the audience. So again, I've learned that as long as you don't beat people up over the head with what your view of the universe is, people are much less uptight in many cases than if you try to battle them on theological points. So I believe there should be a dialogue on theological points, and that's part of our function here. And I believe that what we're doing here is very important. Again, even though the gods can take care of themselves and even if we weren't here, things would go on pretty much like before. We are here and we have contributed towards Olympian works to a greater or lesser degree. So that's why I celebrate Olympia, because even though our perspectives might be different and our experience is different, all of you are giants in my eyes in terms of anchoring the Olympian energies in this day and age and opening people's eyes to the wonders of Olympus and the influence of Olympus. So I want to thank you on that level. How can people get in touch with the Apollonius?
You can get in touch with me at my website, http opsopaeus.com, opsopaus.com, has information about my book. You can email me there, or you can find me, John Opsopaeus, on Facebook.
Thank you very much. And in addition to your deck of Odysseus, of Odyssey cards, you have a wide library of things that you've done throughout your life. Some of them are online, some of them are published through other publishers, and some of them are self-published. How can people find those things?
On my website, opsopaeus.com.
They can also find your your book company through there as well?
Yeah, yeah, yep. And there's links to the books to find the books on Amazon and so forth.
Thank you very much. And Clio, how can people find you, interact with you, and read the things that you write in the grid?
They can, the fastest way actually is to go to the Wild Hunt, wildhunt.org. I write once a month, usually, but not always the first Saturday as a columnist. Look for Clio Ajana. You can also email me any response through there. You can also find me on Facebook under Clio Ajana and just DM me and I get back to people and see what happens. So yeah, that's the fastest way. I'm working on the website, which is why I didn't give the website. But yes.
As soon as you get the website together, we'll gladly post it and promote it and the links on it.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're both incredibly awesome. Thank you for contributing to the quality of my life, especially in matters Olympian. I enjoyed our conversation today. I've enjoyed our previous conversations, and I'm looking forward to our next conversation already. Have a wonderful rest of your day and a wonderful weekend.
You do. So long.
Yeah.
Goodbye.